大家好，欢迎来到海怡讲坛，欢迎来到美丽的澳大利亚。看看今天我身后的背景是澳大利亚的主要城市悉尼的地标，悉尼歌剧院。Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, global time. Welcome to HAIYI Lecture. Welcome to beautiful Australia, the major landmark of Upper House in Sydney. Please see my background of the webinar in Sydney Upper House, which is the major landmark of Sydney, Australia. 今天海怡讲坛的主要的主题是当前的中澳关系对双边经济合作的影响。那么今天呢，我们是采取一个采访的方式，就是和以往不同的方式，而且使用中英双语直播。我呢也准备了一些问题问我们的嘉宾，也请观众呢在这个听的过程中和采访过后呢积极提出问题，也请我们的主讲嘉宾呢为大家分享他的见解。Today's topic of HAIYI Lecture, the impact of current China-Australia relations on bilateral economic cooperation. 今天我们采访的主题呢，这个主要对象是大卫·莫里斯。首先呢，让我介绍大卫·莫里斯先生。大卫·莫里斯先生呢，是我们海怡智库的高级研究员，也是我们北京外国语大学太平洋研究中心的高级研究员。他同时也是聊城大学太平洋岛国研究中心的学术顾问，也是中山大学大洋洲蓝皮书编委会成员。同时，大卫·莫里斯也是他自己的公司叫大卫·莫里斯项目咨询公司的 CEO。大卫·莫里斯先生呢，曾担任澳大利亚的外交官、贸易官员，也曾担任太平洋岛国论坛投资与贸易署北京代表处的首席代表。他是国际政治、国际关系和经济合作方面的资深顾问。David Morris is the Senior Research Fellow of HAIYI Institute and Research Center for Pacific Studies, Beijing Foreign Studies University. Also, he's the academic consultant of Research Center for Pacific Island Country Studies, Liaocheng University. Member of Australia Blog Book Editing Committee of Sun Yat-sen University. He was the Chief Commissioner of Pacific Island Countries Forum Investment and Trade Beijing office. He's also the Vice President of the United Nations Sustainable Business Network for Asia Pacific, CEO of David Morris Project OU. 然后下面呢，我也简单介绍一下这次我们直播的主办方海怡智库，以及作为主持人的我自己。海怡智库是成立于2018年，是独立的现代民间智库，致力于全球问题、外交政策和国际经济政策研究，为政府和企业提供国际合作的智力服务。HAIYI Institute has been founded in 2018. It is an independent, modern, private think tank dedicated to global issues, foreign policy, and international economic policy, etc., providing intelligential services for government and business that collaborate internationally. 那我也想呢，借这个机会介绍一下作为主持人的我自己。我的名字叫牛丽。是海怡智库的执行理事长，也是北京外国语大学太平洋研究中心执行主任。主要的研究方向是太平洋岛国国际关系和经济合作。My name is Miss Lucy Liu. I am the Executive Director for HAIYI Institute, Executive Director for Research Center of Pacific Studies, Beijing Foreign Study University. My research area is Pacific Island International Relations and Economic Cooperation. 那么现在呢，让我介绍一下今天的我的采访的对象David Morris. First, let me introduce Mr. David Morris. Please say hello to audience.
Ni hao, Lucy, and Jia hao to everyone listening. It's great to see you, and it's wonderful to see the Sydney Opera House behind you.
谢谢 ，Thank you，Thank you。因为大家都知道，最近中澳关系非常紧张。这个，因为我在2000年到这个2010年左右呢，经常是在澳洲，所以呢，那个时候澳洲的关系非常好。那最近呢，中澳关系非常紧张，我也想呢，借我们这个直播，把这个问题呢跟大家呢分享一下。首先呢，我准备了几个问题，请这个 David 来跟我们分享。David, I have some questions to ask you. First question is, can you describe the current relation among China, America, and Australia? 那我的第一个问题呢，就是请David描述一下，就是历史上和历史发展以来，中国、美国和澳洲之间到底是什么样的一种关系 ？David, please.
Yes, this is a big question, Lucy. Australia, China, and the US are all such different societies, and I fear that too often we think in stereotypes about each other, in simplistic terms, rather than really seeking to understand each other. So let me begin as a student of Australian history to make some observations about my home country. So let's talk about Australia for a moment. The first thing that strikes anyone about Australia when they fly there or to or from Australia is just how far away it is from almost anywhere. Australia is very isolated. That explains Australia's natural environment, why it's so different, why the animals are so different, and why across the huge expanse of Australia, the 12% of the world's surface, Australia's land and water, really it's largely unchanged by the modern world. So there's a very different environment and a different mentality. And this isolation of Australia means that the island continent has had to rely on trade to prosper, to buy the goods that it cannot produce, and to export those goods that it has in abundance. And of course, Australia is lucky to be rich in resources. But Australia's small population means that it has to rely on investment from overseas to fund and to build its export industries. That's always been the case. And deep in the Australian culture, from this dependence on the outside world, is a pervasive belief, and it's one that I don't share, but to understand Australia, we have to understand that there is a belief in the culture that Australia is unable to defend itself or to chart its own way in the world. This is despite the fact that it's one of the richest countries in the world and it's the dominant military power in its own immediate neighbourhood. But Australia is alone, it's rich, and it's fearful. And I think that sums up something that is deep in the culture from the last couple of centuries of history. And so just as China and the US have mindsets or national outlooks that come from their own unique historical experiences, so does Australia. But from the earliest days of the British colonies that later became Australia, trade and travel with Asia were critical to prosperity. So from the earliest times, natural resources were central to the story of Australia's role in the regional and global economy. Gold was discovered in the middle of the 19th century. That brought many people from China, from southern China especially, to Australia. My own ancestors came to Australia from Germany looking for gold. They didn't find any. But also another important commodity was wool, which really secured Australia's early role in the global supply chains of the British Empire, and investment flowed into Australia from Britain for a long time. And so from that early prosperity, the colonies that later became Australia became world-renowned for their prosperity, but also their successful social and political experimentation. They became world leaders in worker conditions, in democratic reforms, including votes for women and secret voting, and pensions and other early forms of the modern welfare state. So Australia in the late 19th century was a deeply democratic society and at the same time a trading place, a trading nation with other countries that were very different from itself.
这个问题提得非常好。澳大利亚、中国和美国都是非常不同的社会。我现在先来说一下澳大利亚吧。那些飞去澳大利亚或者从澳大利亚起飞的人，第一个深刻的感受就是澳大利亚和其他大陆真的相距遥远。这就解释了澳大利亚为什么有着独特的自然环境，它的动植物也是和其他地区都是不一样的。而澳大利亚占据了世界表面的总面积的12%，但是在现代发展中却没有太大的变化。同时，澳大利亚的心态也是和其他地区不一样的。所以说，澳大利亚是一个一个比较独立的国家，同时它就需要依靠贸易来发展自身，购买它无法生产的产品和出口它富裕的产品。澳大利亚的人口不多，同样意味着它需要依靠外部投资来发展出口业。即使澳大利亚是世界上最富裕的国家之一，但是澳大利亚因为对外部世界的依靠，也就在某种程度上说明了澳大利亚可能无法很好的自我防卫。这个观点虽然我不认同，但是却是事实存在的。所以总结来说，澳大利亚孤独、富有、感到恐惧。早期澳大利亚是英国的殖民地，与亚洲的贸易交往对于澳大利亚的繁荣非常重要。在早期，澳大利亚的自然资源对于它在地区和全球经济中站稳脚跟非常重要。20世纪中期，在澳大利亚发现了金矿，而澳大利亚淘金热就吸引了中国南方人和其他地方的人来澳洲致富。我的祖先是德国人，也是来到澳大利亚想来致富的。另一个重要的商品就是羊毛，羊毛也巩固了澳大利亚在全球供应链中的地位。从英国来的外资不断涌入澳大利亚，在早期繁荣中，澳大利亚也就是之前的英国殖民地，以改善工人环境和民主改革而闻名。这些民主改革包括妇女的投票权、不记名投票、养老金以及其他现代民主制度中的一些形式。所以说，总的来说，澳大利亚是一个非常民主的国家，同时它的贸易也是非常发达的。
But there are a few more things to say about Australian history, because not only had Australia prospered from trade, but there were also trends in the culture of Australia in its first decades that meant the new nation, when it was formed, would turn inwards rather than look outwards to the world around it. The same British colonies that had prospered so much from trade and investment joined together to create the new nation of Australia in 1901 and subsequently embraced a philosophy of protectionism. This word that we associate today with economics had a much wider meaning, though, in British Australia. The new nation founded on an ideology of racial exclusion, both denying the existence of Indigenous Australians and also committed to preventing immigration from Asia. So China, from very early in Australian history, actually became a key source of fear for these early Australians who, strangely to our modern imagination, defined themselves by their Britishness. And Australia, in its early decades as an independent nation, turned its back on Asia, and it built high tariff walls against trade with Asia to keep products out, and behind which Australians built ever less productive and less competitive industries. And it's important to understand these formative early decades of Australia in the early 20th century, because I think they demonstrate a lesson. They demonstrate how easy it was for a period of globalization and internationalization in the late 19th century to very quickly be replaced in the early 20th century by populist fear and inward protectionism. In just a generation, this massively changed. And of course, as we know, those trends were reinforced by the outside world. There were world wars, there was the Spanish flu pandemic, there was later a Cold War, and all of these trends kept Australians firmly gripped by fear of the outside world. And so throughout much of the 20th century, as Australia's economy declined in competitiveness and dropped down the ladder of prosperity, its political class, its leadership, kept the focus firmly on external enemies and locked into an alliance dependency on the United States, which made sense because of the support from the United States in the Second World War. But Australia went far beyond the alliances that other nations had with the US. For example, a fundamental focus of the 1960s in Australia, the time that I grew up, was Australia demonstrating its loyalty to the US in the disastrous Vietnam War, while other US allies wisely cautioned America against it. Because of their shared democratic culture, it's very easy for Australians and Americans, just like Australians and British, to believe they see the world through the same eyes.
但是同时在澳大利亚文化中，我们也看到一些迹象，就是澳大利亚在之后是逐渐向内发展的，而不是有一个全球视野。这些因为贸易和投资而繁荣起来的英属殖民地，在1991年时合并，并创立了一个新的国家，也就是澳大利亚，而之后则转向了贸易保护主义。现在我们通常与经济学联系起来这个单词，在当时对于英属澳大利亚人则有着更加深远的含义。澳大利亚的建国是基于种族排斥政策，它既不承认澳大利亚土著人的存在，同时也阻止来自亚洲的移民。对于早期的澳大利亚人来说，中国就是他们恐惧的来源之一。现在我们很难想象当时的澳大利亚人是将自己定义为英国人，于是澳大利亚这个独立的国家便背弃亚洲，征收高额的关税来阻止亚洲产品进入澳大利亚，而澳大利亚建立起的却是越来越缺乏生产力和竞争力的产业。对于我们来说，理解20世纪早期的澳大利亚是非常重要的，因为他们向我们展示了在19世纪还是盛行全球主义和国际主义，而到了20世纪却轻易地转向了民粹主义和对内的保护主义。当然我们都知道，这种趋势是受到了世界大战、西班牙大流感以及冷战的影响，所以说澳大利亚才开始对外部世界有所害怕。在20世纪的大部分时间里，澳大利亚经济下滑，不如以往繁荣，而它的政治阶层却关注的是外部敌人，更加依赖美国。当然这也说得通，因为澳大利亚在二战时也是支持的美国，而美澳联盟是世界上联系最紧密的联盟之一。比如说在20世纪60年代，也就是我成长的那个年代，澳大利亚就通过参加越战对美表示忠心，而当时美国的盟友都谨慎地避免了这一现象。因为澳大利亚和美国有着共同的民主文化，所以对于他们来说，他们看世界的角度非常相似。
So I think it's important to understand that Australia in these decades as it developed as a young nation really saw itself as existing within a British world and then later an American world, and it was comfortable in those worlds. But something happened in the second half of the 20th century that fundamentally changed Australia's position and its economic interests in particular. Britain joined the European Economic Community, which later, of course, became the European Union. And overnight, Australia lost access to its largest export market, and it had to look elsewhere. It had to innovate. and Australia looked to Asia. Initially, it looked to Japan, and later, of course, to markets across the Asian region. And Australia entered into a period of reform and experimentation again, rather like the period of the late 19th century when Australia was a laboratory of social and economic reform. Again, in the 1980s and 90s, actually from the 70s, it started to socially reform. It got rid of its discriminatory White Australia policy. It started to welcome migrants from Asia. It recognised the People's Republic of China. It started on a journey of tariff reform and opening to global competition. And by the 1990s, Australia was back. It had become competitive again, successful again. It was leading the OECD, the wealthy countries, in productivity, and it had become confident from its model of economic and social liberalisation. And so Australia joined other Asian economies and the US to build APEC and to pursue a philosophy and a practice of open regionalism that would benefit all countries across the Asia-Pacific region. And it was in this context that the modern, confident Australia of the late 20th century, opening to the region, that Australia and China developed their modern relationship. It did not start out as a dependency, as some commentators today describe the relationship. Rather, Australia and China were complementary economies, both offering the other what it needed. Just as with Japan in the 1970s to the 1990s, by the turn of the century, Australia had become a major supplier to China of resources, food and higher education, while welcoming tourists, capital and competitively priced manufactured imports from China. And so this reform and opening period of China over the last 4 decades has been not only a time of increasing prosperity for China, but it's also been a golden era for the Australian economy. And so the question that many of us who worked in this relationship between Australia and China over recent decades, the question we've asked is, can we add some ballast, some strength and some breadth to this relationship so we can we broaden it from simply being a narrow transactional economic relationship, which would always be fragile to disruption, to make it a more resilient and robust relationship? Because to be sure, the two countries are very different. And inevitably, they're going to have disputes and misunderstandings from time to time. This remains Australia's great challenge in its neighbourhood generally. The Asia-Pacific is not a region of liberal democracies like Europe or North America, where perhaps Australia culturally would feel more at home. The Asia-Pacific is a neighbourhood of countries pursuing development through a wide variety of governance models. And unlike the US, though, Australia is more pragmatic, actually, and generally it doesn't seek to export or impose its governance model.
从前，澳大利亚受到英国文化的影响，而如今它更多的受到了美国文化的影响。在20世纪后半叶所发生的事情，则根本上转变了澳大利亚的经济利益。英国加入了欧洲经济共同体，也就是之后的欧盟，而一夜之间，澳大利亚发现它无法进入其最大的出口市场，则在这个时期，它就转向了亚洲，首先是日本，然后是其他国家。也正是在这个时期，澳大利亚开始了一系列的经济社会改革，一些试验，不再实行它歧视的白澳政策，欢迎亚洲移民，承认中华人民共和国的合法地位，以及开始了关税改革的时期，同时也面向国际竞争。20世纪90年代的时候，澳大利亚又重新变得更有竞争力，在经合组织中名列前茅。澳大利亚对于自己经济模式和社会自由化是非常自信的，于是与其他亚洲经济体和美国创立了亚太经合组织，追求更加开放的地区主义，而这是会使所有亚太地区的国家都受益的。也就是在这个时期，一个开放、自信、 现代的澳大利亚同中国开始发展起了关系。现在的评论家可能都会认为，二者出发点都在于其的依赖性。事实上，澳大利亚和中国具有很强的经济互补性，能够提供对方所需求的。正如澳大利亚与美国在20世纪70年代到90年代的关系一样，到了世纪之交时，澳大利亚成为中国主要的原材料、食品、高等教育的供应国，也欢迎来自中国的游客、资金和物美价廉的工业制成品。在过去40年，中国的改革开放不仅使中国人民受益其中，同时也促进了澳大利亚经济的发展。我们近些年可能会问的问题就是，我们能否使中澳关系更上一层楼，从一个简单的经济交易关系变成一个更有韧性的关系？因为简单的贸易关系可能很容易受到双方分歧的影响，但是可以肯定的说，这两个国家都是非常不同的，偶尔也会出现分歧和误解。这也就是澳大利亚在亚太地区最大的挑战。亚太地区并不是像欧洲和北美那样的政体，在欧洲和北美，澳大利亚可能会更加自在，而事实就是亚太地区有着不同的国家治理模式。而与美国不同的是，澳大利亚并不希望让所有国家都接受它自己的治理模式。
In the last few decades, while I've been working in the field of Australia's international relations, Australia has begun to grapple with the need to learn more about Asia and to understand the diversity of our region, encouraged by the successful growth models of East Asia. It worked in both directions. Asian students came to Australia in large numbers. China-Australia links grew rapidly. There was a healthy expansion of China studies in Australia and Australian studies in Chinese universities, a remarkable growth in people-to-people connections, with Chinese becoming the second most spoken language in Australia. And in fact, more than 1 million Australians out of just 25 million have a Chinese background. Australia is a remarkably more global and connected society from its multiculturalism today than it was half a century ago. And it's increasingly aware that its future security and prosperity must be found in rather than against Asia. So Australia has widely established relationships across the region after being ambivalent for far too long. Its biggest, though, and broadest economic relationship is with China. And at the same time, its biggest and broadest security relationship is with the United States. So this puts Australia in an interesting position.
过去几十年，我一直都在研究澳大利亚的国际关系，也正是在这个时候，澳大利亚开始向亚洲学习，理解本地区的多元性。这也得益于东亚巨大的经济成功，大量的亚洲学生来到澳大利亚，中澳关系发展良好。在澳大利亚有更多关于中国研究，在中国大学也有更多关于澳大利亚的研究，民间交流繁盛。在澳大利亚，汉语已经成为了第2大语言，每2500万人中就有100万人有中国背景。与50年前相比，澳大利亚更加全球化，与世界联系更加紧密。而且他也意识到，澳大利亚未来的安全和繁荣必须依赖亚洲，而不是要和亚洲对抗。于是他便在这个时期与亚洲建立更广泛的联系。中澳之间有着最广泛的经济关系，而美澳之间有着最广泛的安全关系，这就使得澳大利亚的处境十分有趣。
谢谢 David， 谢谢 David。我的第二个问题是， 您怎么样评价目前的中澳关系？另外呢，什么样一个深层的原因使得什么样的一个深层的原因使得澳大利亚追随美国？My second question is how you view about the current relationship between China and Australia. What is the deep reason for Australia follow America? I think this is a little bit sensitive question. Please, David.
Australia and China have a very important economic relationship. It's a $200 billion trade relationship. This is fundamentally important to both countries. Even though Chinese outward foreign investment has dropped in recent times, there's a significant stock of Chinese investment in Australia, diversified across resources, agriculture, healthcare, and of course in property. There's a free trade agreement. There's a comprehensive strategic partnership. Australia is a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But there's no doubt the bilateral relationship has fallen into a hole in the last couple of years. Rather than trying to find a way out of that hole, which would appear to be in both countries' interests and which has always worked in the past whenever there have been disputes or differences, it appears that this year each action and counteraction is simply digging deeper into a hole. The problem is that it's no longer a question of two complementary trading partners figuring out a solution to the occasional dispute or misunderstanding. That would be normal, but we're in a new normal. The Australia-China relationship is no longer about Australia and China, but it's become internationalised. It has become caught up in something much bigger, a trend towards geopolitical contest and confrontation between the United States and China. Both the US and China are seeking to make an example of Australia. Traditional security thinking in Australia looks to repeat the same old habits of the past, demonstrating its loyalty to its big and powerful ally by any means necessary. But in the new normal, Australia actually, in my view, has to find its own voice and its own solution to balance its relationships with both China as an economic partner and the US as a security partner, rather than choosing one over the other. This appears, though, impossible to many observers, but it's not, in my view. It will require leadership, because leadership is about looking forward to what is possible in the future and not about just looking back to what we did in the past.
中澳两国的经济关系非常重要，现在中澳贸易额已经达到了2000亿美元。即使近些年中国的对外投资有所下降，但中国对澳大利亚的投资仍非常可观，分散在资源、农业、医疗保健和房地产中。中澳之间签订了自由贸易协定，是全面战略伙伴关系。同时，澳大利亚还是亚投行的成员国之一。但是，两国的双边关系出现了问题，在过去几年。特别是在过去几年出现了挺严重的问题，双方并没有找出一个解决方案，这在过去都是解决分歧的方式，但是现在，特别是今年，双方的行动则更具对抗性。现在的问题不再是两个经济互补性强的贸易伙伴为偶尔出现的争端和误解寻找解决方案，这样子反而是正常的。现在则出现了一种新的情况。中澳关系不再仅仅只是关乎中国和澳大利亚两个国家，现在这个问题更具国际化。两国的关系的大背景就是中美之间日益激化的地缘政治竞争和对抗。美国和中国都希望为澳大利亚做一个榜样，但是传统的思维仍是澳大利亚需要重复过去的做法。表明对更加强大的国家表示它的忠心，但是在新常态下，澳大利亚需要发出自己的声音，这也是我所认为的，需要找到平衡 中澳、美澳之间的关系，而不是选择站边。对于许多观察者来说，这看上去似乎是不可能的，但是我认为其实不然，这需要更强大的领导力，因为领导力就是对未来的事件进行展望，而不是重复老一套。
So the global supply chains that Australia has benefited from are now integrated with China. Yet Australia's national security infrastructure that it has also benefited from are integrated with the United States. The apparent conflict of interest first became apparent when Australia became the first country to take a ban approach against the Chinese firm Huawei. So this is a very controversial issue, but let's talk about it frankly, because this was one of the first problems. So Australia decided in 2012 to prevent Huawei from participating in its national broadband network, and then 6 years later, it prevented Huawei from participating in its 5G network. And the Australian government based its decision on an assessment, it appears by its intelligence agencies, of potential cyber threats to critical infrastructure. This signalled a deep strategic distrust, which was also manifesting at the same time in the United States and in other US allies. And so it's important for us to think about this question of distrust. And there's a paradox here. The paradox is that the evidence of actual security threats is not necessary if you have this distrust. So it's not necessarily about evidence. It's just about naming the risk. And that naming the risk becomes enough in this new climate of distrust. And this is partly because the United States and Europe have an expectation that a rising power, which happens to be China, will act like any other rising power in the past, seeking world domination. And so we're in this position where, despite decades of mutually beneficial economic cooperation, the new geopolitical climate and the mindset changes everything. But must it? Is this necessary? I suggest that we need to take a pragmatic risk management approach to these international relationships rather than surrender to a simplistic black and white geopolitical way of thinking. So this applies not just to technology, but to food security or to any supply chain, any area in which we're trading or investing. We surely need to identify what the risks are that worry us and then develop risk mitigation strategies.
澳大利亚从全球供应链中获益颇丰，现在这个全球供应链也正与中国融合。然而，澳大利亚的国家安全基础设施确实与美国联系日益紧密，这就出现了许多问题，特别是华为问题。我知道这是一个非常有争议的话题，我今天就来坦诚地谈一谈。首先，在2012年，澳大利亚是第一个禁止华为参与其宽带网络建设的国家，而到了2018年，澳大利亚又禁止华为参与其 5G 建设。澳大利亚政府做出这个决定是基于对未来网络威胁的评估，这其实体现的是一个深层的战略上的不互信，而这种不互信也体现在美国和美国盟友身上。那么现在就有这样一个悖论，这个悖论就是虽然没有事实上的安全威胁的一个实证，但是仅仅提出这些安全威胁就已经足够了。美国和欧洲都预计中国会像过去的传统大国一样，崛起之后会寻求世界霸权。所以说，即使在过去几十年，双方的经济合作都是相当成功的，但是新的政治景象仍旧是改变了所有。所以，那么我建议我们对国际关系需要采取一种风险管理的 方式，而不是屈从于黑白分明的思维模式。让我们来找出那些让我们担心的风险，无论是在食品供应链还是贸易中，然后再制定出解决方式。
So the banning of Huawei is just one issue of many that have caused problems in the relationship. But it's one that I've looked at, I've researched it and thought carefully about these questions around cyber risks. And I think technology is a good example of where risks are always going to be present. But the question is, should we trust one great power but not trust another great power? Is that actually the logical way to think about risks? Or might a more logical way to be to take a proportionate risk management approach, to be supplier blind, to not think about the company or the country that it comes from, but actually to build in robust systems of monitoring and testing for risks, for vulnerabilities, for system resilience and robustness. And this would be an approach that considers that risks in technology can come from anywhere. They might come from rogue individuals, they might come from non-state actors or state-sponsored cyber attacks. But thinking about the risks themselves rather than the origin of the risks, rather than taking a geopolitical approach, might actually be a more effective way to manage these risks. And in other fields as well, beyond technology, a one-eyed geopolitical approach is equally self-defeating. We have had carefully constructed rules of world trade to regulate safe food supply chains, for example, ensuring food security to nations that are unable to meet their own food needs. So any securitization of trade in food supplies, sanctions or other political measures only undermines that global system of reliable, safe food security. Australia, for example, should remain a trusted supplier of food security to Asian markets, including China, regardless of what other political or geopolitical disputes may occur. Declining trust and its logical consequence, the dismantling of global supply chains and global rules, is not in Australia's interests, nor China's interests. Both have prospered in the rules-based system of liberalised trade and investment of recent decades and in an environment of the World Trade Organization and trade and investment agreements. Yet there are security-driven agendas at play encouraging decoupling and this fanciful division of the world into a new Cold War, when actually our economies are deeply interdependent.
华为事件只是一个例子。我们目前虽然受到了很多网络威胁，但是不应该仅仅只是关注网络威胁来源于何处。技术就是永远会出现一些风险的，但是信任一个国家，然后不信任一个国家，就是最好的解决之道吗？更加适当的风险管理方式就是不应考虑提供服务的公司来源于何处，而是应该建立更完善的体系，检测出薄弱之处，同样也能够提高系统的韧性和健壮性。这样的方式是能够更有效地检测出危害国家安全的人、非国家行动者和受到政府资助的网络攻击。这种方法远比单一的地缘政治思维方式来得更好。在除了技术之外的其他领域，仅从地缘政治思维方面思考，同样是会弄巧成拙。比如说，我们有非常完善的规则规范了安全的食品供应链，保证了那些无法满足自身需求国家的食品安全。对于这些食品供应链的证券化制裁或者其他政治措施，都只会破坏安全的供应链。无论地缘中澳之间的地缘或政治分歧，澳大利亚应该都继续为亚洲提供安全的食品，包括中国。而日渐下降的不互信导致的必然结果，也就是全球供应链和全球规则的解体， 不符合澳大利亚，也不符合中国的利益。最近几年，我们都从自由贸易和投资中获益良多，但是以国家安全问题为导向的这些议程却加剧了全球脱钩，造成世界分裂。但是我们现在这个社会是更加相互依存的。
So both Australia and China benefited from the open regionalism of the Asia Pacific in recent decades, and both, even today, are working behind the scenes to construct an important new regional trading order, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So does this mean that these disputes that are rooted in geopolitical competition can be overcome perhaps by the Asia Pacific's famous pragmatism? It remains an open question whether the new geopolitical language of the Indo-Pacific replacing the Asia-Pacific is part of a push to divide the region or not. To be sure, the military security establishments in each country have an important job to do. Their job is to plan for worst-case scenarios. For the rest of us, though, our equally important task is to make sure that we never sink into those worst-case scenarios. The Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, whatever we want to call it, it's far better thought of as a vast, diverse region that benefits from open and integrated trade and investment. No one country can actually dominate such a diverse span of the world and the rules that must govern its economic integration. Australia has always benefited as a middle power from a rules-based order. The US in recent times has unfortunately begun to lose confidence in the rules-based order that it helped construct in the post-war era. Under Donald Trump, the US has escalated this process. As a major power with its own exceptionalist culture, the US tends to see the world in binary terms as good versus evil. I think Australians are less ideological generally and more pragmatic. And this is why perhaps Australia will cease in the years ahead to see the world through the binary eyes of a traditional world power and start to see the world through its own eyes. It is surely in Australia's interests to work with its region, not against it, and with all members of its region, not only with or against one. Figuring out how to negotiate the relationship between two very different nations but with complementary economies, Australia and China, is one of the critical problems for Australia in the new multipolar order.
中澳两国都从亚太地区的开放地区主义中受益颇多，而且也逐渐在建立一个地区贸易秩序，也就是区域全球经济伙伴关系。这也就意味着根植于地缘政治竞争的争端能够被亚洲的务实主义所克服吗？现在我们还不清楚印度太平洋取代亚太地区的这个说法能否加剧地区分裂，但可以肯定的是，各国都有重要的事情做，为最坏的情况做打算。而对于剩下的我们来说，同样重要的事情就是确保我们不再陷入这种最坏的情况。无论是亚太还是印度太平洋，或者你想怎么说都可以，需要从开放的贸易和投资中要获得一些利处的。没有一个国家能够统治如此大的地区，所以我们需要建立起一些制度。作为一个中等强国，澳大利亚从这种基于规则的秩序中得到了一些好处，而最近一些年，美国对这种制度失去了信心。但是这种制度帮助我们重塑了战后时期的重建工作。特朗普在任期间则加剧了这一进程。美国这个超级大国奉行的是例外主义意识，认为世界是黑白分明的。但是澳大利亚就不是那么特别在意意识形态，也更加务实。这就是为什么澳大利亚在近些年以自己的观点看世界，而不是以传统的一个强国视角看世界。与亚太地区合作是符合澳大利亚的利益的，而且需要 和所有国家合作，不是与某一个国家合作，也不是反对某一个国家。在全球多极化的环境中，协商中澳关系是澳大利亚面临的一个重要问题。
谢谢 David。David， 您知道我们海医智库的主要工作呢，也是我们这么多年来一直致力于呢，主要工作是推动中国企业走出去，这个主要是在投资和贸易方面。但是我们注意到呢，最近的中国的蒙牛集团对澳大利亚的狮子的乳业集团的收购，已经按照澳大利亚的商业规则，已经获得澳大利亚外国投资委员会的批准，但是呢，最终仍然被澳大利亚的联邦政府拒绝。那么我们这个中国如何避免中国投资商面临的这个政治风险？David, as you know, HAIYI Institute, our major work is for promote China companies to go abroad for investment and trade. But we noticed that recently China Mengniu, a dairy group, purchased the Australia Lion Dairy Group. It already been approved by Australia Foreign Investment Authority, but still rejected by Australia federal government. So could you please advise us how to avoid the Chinese investors' potential political risk? Thank you.
Yes, Lucy, this is why I am researching political risk at the moment, because I think political risk is the major problem now in the trade and investment relationship in both directions. Both countries have taken actions that would not occur in normal circumstances of trust and cooperation. The problem is binary thinking. We're taking sides as if we're in a game, but unfortunately, game theory is very influential in security thinking and planning. But in the real world is not a game, and it's not a binary. It's not good versus evil or trustworthy versus untrusted. In fact, we know in the real world that we have decades of successful Australia and China trade and investment. So we've had successful Chinese investments in Australia, successful Australian investments in China. There have also been some failures, but we've learnt that we have very different business environments, different political systems, but through learning about each other and building relationships, investments have been very successful. Now, though, as you point out, politics and geopolitics appear to be intervening. Although, of course, we can never know the full story behind individual cases. Perhaps there's more behind an individual case than we read in the media. As I know from my own experience, sometimes the media can simplify matters. So rather than focus on one case, which I don't have the expert knowledge to talk about, I would underline that we need to step back and we need to tackle the underlying political and geopolitical issues. If there's a lack of trust, if governments are wielding economic coercion or taking other arbitrary actions in either direction, we need to get to the reason why. We need to address the declining trust. It may be that in the real world, we can never have complete trust at the government-to-government level, no matter how strong the relationships might be at the people-to-people level or at the business-to-business level. We need to therefore look at the rules that govern our trade and investment relationship and see if they're adequate to protect the interests of all parties. And if they're not, then we need to address that. The Asia-Pacific region has a strong track record of building rules and cooperation for trade and investment that has worked in the interests of all parties, investors and investees, and it has involved a large number of governments of different political persuasions that may not always trust one another at the political level. The alternative is to try to find rules and norms for our trade and investment relationship is for trust to continue to decline. That's the alternative. And it's not in anyone's interests unless you subscribe to game theory and that all of this is a game and that it will lead to conflict and one party winning and the other party losing. I just don't accept that thinking. I don't accept that the world works that way or that the world needs to be a game. We should expect better of our leaders, to find solutions rather than to make the problems worse.
目前我所研究的也是政治风险。政治风险现在是双边贸易和投资关系中的主要问题。双方国家都采取了在正常互信的情况下不会采取的措施。真正的问题就在于二元对立思维。我们好像身处一场博弈，都在选边站。但不幸的是，博弈论是非常适用于安全思维和规划中的。事实上是，现实社会并不是一场博弈，也不是一个二元对立的世界。好或坏，不值得信任或值得信任。事实上，在过去几十年，中澳双向投资都是非常成功的。即使有失败的例子，但我们双方都了解了对方国家的商业环境和政治体制都是不同的。而现在，新政治和地缘政治介入了商业中，虽然我们无法了解全局，有时候事情也不是我们在新闻上读到的那样。以我自己来说吧，媒体呈现的事情可能会与事件大相径庭，所以说我今天就不主要讲一个个单独的例子了。我想强调的就是，我们应该解决更深层次的政治和地缘政治问题。如果这没有政治互信的话，政府也在经济上采取了强制或专断行为，我们就要了解背后的原因。我们也需要解决日益下降的互信。也许在现实世界，无论民间交流如何繁荣，政府间永远不可能有完全的互信。所以说，我们需要审视那些规则、贸易和投资关系的准则，看他们是否保护了各方的利益。如果没有的话，我们就要解决这个问题。亚太地区制定了一系列有关贸易和投资的规则，这都符合各方投资者和接受投资者的利益。但是我们现在的问题就是，如果我们不找到一些新的规则的话，我们之间的互信只会越来越少，这也不满足所有人的利益。但是如果你用博弈论来解释这个事情的话，一切都说得通。将所有的事情看作是一场博弈，最终会导致冲突，而且是出现一方赢一方输的局面。我个人是不赞同这样的看法的。我们应该对我们的领导人有着更高的要求，希望他们找到解决方式，而不是让事情变得更糟。
谢谢。那 David，你认为目前中国和澳大利亚双方应该做哪些工作来改善中澳关系？ David, what you think should both China and Australia do to improve bilateral relations? Thank you.
Well, I think there are a few very simple things that we could do, Lucy. One is talk. It's absurd that the two countries that are so interdependent and have such a long, successful history of working together are not talking to each other at the highest levels on a regular basis. So talking would help. Listening would also help. There are China scholars, business leaders and others with deep experience of China in Australia. And also in China, there are scholars, business leaders and others with deep experience and understanding of Australia. So we need to listen to this deep expertise rather than simply respond to the securitized debate of recent years that is often dominated by people with a superficial understanding of the other country. The other thing we need to do is act. We just need to get on with our relationship, because every day there is trade, investment, and in normal times when we're not dealing with a pandemic, there's movement of people for education, for tourism, doing business, and the general people-to-people exchange between Australia and China, which is rich And these activities take place because of the rules and standards and norms that govern our relations. So if trust has declined in recent times, we need to act to uphold and strengthen the rules, standards and norms according to which these everyday mutual interest-based interactions can continue.
我们可以做一些非常简单的事情来促进中国和澳大利亚的关系。第一件事情就是对话。两个如此依赖的国家却没有定期举办高级别对话是非常荒谬的事情，所以对话肯定是有帮助的。第二件事情就是聆听。在澳大利亚有许多中国学者、商人和中国通，而在中国也有许多澳大利亚学者、商人和澳大利亚通，我们就需要倾听他们的意见，而不是简简单单的对近年来的证券化问题做出回应。似乎主导这场对话的人是那些对对方国家只有着肤浅理解的人。第三，行动。每一天中澳之间都有相当多的贸易、投资，正常情况下也有许多因教育、旅游、商业的人员流动。那么这都得益于主导我们关系的规则、标准和规范，而我们就要做出行动来加强这些规则。
谢谢 David。今天我们采访的部分呢就到这里。下面我们问一下这个观众有没有问题啊 ？David， 稍等我一下，我来看看观众有没有问题。请观众呢提一些问题，我们留几分钟的时间。David, because the time limited, so our interview section we can stop here. Then the next we will, hear any questions from our audience. Any questions? 有问题吗？ Any questions? 他目前好像还没有问题。OK。没有问题，没有问题。David, in our the APP of audience, there's no more questions. Our time 1 hour is over. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your interview. And you are as an Australian and I am as a Chinese, our relationship, we are as a very good example for Australia-China good relationship. 我刚才跟David 说呢，因为这个我们通常直播是1个小时的时间，那么这个他作为澳大利亚人，我作为中国人，我们之间的友好的关系是一个澳中关系一个非常好的一个典范，所以我们也希望呢。这个我们澳中关系呢和澳中的经济合作呢，这个就是继续的要转好啊，非常感谢 ，Thank you, David。那我们跟观众说再见，跟观众说再见，感谢大家，感谢大家，再见，我们下一期见，再见，
再见
，Thank you, David，拜拜。